Welcome to Reformed Thinking. We take a single word, a central concept, or maybe a specific piece of historical context, and we try to use the sources to unlock, a deeper understanding of Scripture. Today, we're doing a deep dive into just one Hebrew word, but it's a really significant one, or hêḳāl.
Right.
If you read the historical books or the prophets, the Psalms, this term, it just pops up constantly. It usually gets translated as temple, sometimes palace, maybe sanctuary. But the story behind it, its history, its etymology, even how popular it became over time.
Well, it tells a much bigger story, I think, than any single English word can really capture.
That's exactly right. Our mission today, you could say, is to kind of act like linguistic detectives.
Okay.
We're tracking the life of this word, hêla, across the entire Old Testament. And what you find is, well, it's fascinating. The basic meaning, this idea of a grand palace or dwelling, that stays pretty much the same.
But how that meaning gets applied, and maybe more importantly, how often it gets used in the Bible, that changes dramatically depending on where you are in Israel's history.
So the core idea is stable, but its usage shifts.
Precisely. And this linguistic evolution, it's not just random chance. It actually maps almost perfectly onto Israel's political and theological journey. You see it mirroring the whole process of centralization, the move towards, establishing a permanent, fixed sanctuary, the temple in Jerusalem.
And here's something that, well, it grabbed my attention right away. This word hêla, which seems so central to the idea of God's presence being fixed in one place, it's completely missing from the earliest books of the Bible.
That's a huge point.
You just don't find it. Not in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, or Deuteronomy.
Entire Pentateuch, yeah.
And that absence, from the texts dealing with the covenant being formed, the time in the wilderness, that silence is just as revealing, I think, is why it suddenly becomes so common later during the monarchy.
It really is.
We need to figure out, why was a word that means grand, permanent building just not the right fit for describing God's presence back then in the desert?
Let's start right there at the beginning, linguistically speaking. If we want to follow the story of hêl, we need to understand its origins, its DNA, so to speak.
Okay.
So the word shows up 78 times in the Old Testament. Now, compared to a word like Beit, which means house, that's actually not a huge number. Statistically, it's kind of rare.
78 times isn't that much, relatively speaking.
Not when Beit appears over 2,000 times, no. But those 78 occurrences of hêl, they're placed very strategically. They carry enormous weight theologically and architecturally. And the evidence we have strongly suggests that hêl probably wasn't originally a Hebrew word at all. This used to be a loan word.
Ah, okay. Imported.
Imported, yeah. Which immediately makes you ask, why borrow a word? Why not use something from their own vocabulary?
Well, sometimes foreign words sound, more impressive, like using a French word for cooking or something. It lends a certain air.
That could definitely be part of it.
Yeah.
If you trace its linguistic family tree back through the ancient Near East, you actually bypass Hebrew altogether initially.
Really?
Yeah. We can trace it pretty directly to an Akkadian word, okalu.
Akkadian, so Mesopotamian.
Exactly. And if you keep going back further into Mesopotamian history, that Akkadian term okalu itself comes from Sumerian.
Wow.
From the Sumerian compound egal. And egal, it's quite simple but powerful. It means large house, or more to the point, palace, the royal residence, the seat of power.
Okay, that detail about the foreign background, that feels really important. It suggests maybe a deliberate choice by the people building the temple and writing about it during the monarchy.
I think so.
If you're reaching for a word that has roots in Sumerian and Akkadian administrative language, you're not just describing, a building. You're making a statement. You're projecting status on a geopolitical level.
Right.
You're basically claiming that Israel's God isn't just some local deity. He's a king. And his house, his hêßāl rivals, or maybe even surpasses the grand palaces of those powerful Mesopotamian empires.
It definitely suggests grandeur, institutional power, right from the start.
Yeah. State institutionalization.
And that leads directly to why the word basically has this dual meaning running side by side, the secular and the sacred.
Okay, let's unpack that. So the secular side first. Hêl means palace. A big, magnificent building for an earthly king.
Correct.
But you said, interestingly, that even though it can mean that, it's not actually used that way very often in the Hebrew Bible itself.
That's right. It's rather seldom used for just any king's house. We do see it, for instance, connected with King Ahab's palace in 1 Kings 21. And that's, a place linked to royal overreach and injustice, the whole Naboth's vineyard story.
Right. Not exactly a positive context.
Not at all. And then it also gets used to describe these, well, foreign centers of power, like the palace of the king of Babylon, when Hezekiah foolishly shows off all his treasures. That's in 2 Kings 20, and Isaiah 39 tells the same story.
Ah, okay, so foreign palaces, symbols of potentially threatening power.
Often, yes. It's used for the palaces of Nineveh, too, in Nahum. And it pops up in later books dealing with foreign settings like Daniel or even Proverbs, talking about lizards in kings' palaces.
So it can mean a regular palace, but it's rare and often associated with foreign or problematic rulers.
Exactly. And that scarcity points to something important linguistically. When the biblical writers just wanted to talk about the normal royal residence of an Israelite king without adding that layer of, imported grandeur,
Yeah.
the standard homegrown Hebrew phrase was ga bet hamale.
Yeah.
Literally, the king's house. Simple, direct.
Okay, so Bet Hameleh is the default for King's House. Hal's reserved for something grander, more imposing.
Something that needed that extra sense of magnificence, yeah. Drawing on that high culture, Mesopotamian, originally Sumerian origin. It carries that weight.
Which then leads us right into the sacred use. If hêḳāl is the word for a truly magnificent royal palace, for an earthly king,
then it makes perfect sense that it gets adopted as the technical term for a temple or a sanctuary, because the temple is conceived as the palace of God, who is considered the ultimate king.
God's palace.
Exactly. The earthly sanctuary is thought of, architecturally, as a royal residence, a state building almost, the fixed location of divine rule. And this technical use, it wasn't unique to Israel either. We see the same word hêḳāl used in related languages, like in Phoenician texts, Palmyrene texts.
Meaning temple in those contexts, too.
Meaning a main temple structure, yes.
Yeah.
So for Israel, choosing this word, this loan word with palace connotations, it signals a major shift in thinking. God's dwelling isn't just a place to meet him or offer sacrifice anymore. It's become a fixed, institutional, magnificent royal court established in the capital city.
Okay, so we've got the definition down. Magnificent royal dwelling, used for both kings and God. Now let's get into that drama you mentioned, the when and the how. How Israel decides to actually apply this specific word to God's house on earth. Because, as you said, it starts out absent, then it's rare, then it becomes standard. That timeline has to tell us something.
It tells us a lot about Israel's institutional development. Let's call the first phase the early absence. And we really can't emphasize this enough. Hêḳāl is just never used in those foundational books, Genesis through Joshua, the Hexateuch.
And that's a deliberate choice, you think, not just an accident of vocabulary.
I think it has to be theological. During that early period, the Mosaic period, the main place of worship was the Shiloh, the tent of meeting.
Right, the tabernacle.
The tabernacle, exactly.
Right.
And the tent symbolized something very different. It represented God's presence as portable, accessible. It suggested a covenant relationship that was mobile, that could adapt as the people moved through the wilderness.
God moving with his people.
Precisely. Now, think about the word hêḳāl. With its connotations of being fixed, massive, permanent, royal, it would have been almost the opposite, theologically, of what the tent represented.
Yeah, I can see that. One moves, the other is rooted.
Hêḳāl is an urban word. It's a state word. It implies permanence and location. That just doesn't fit the theology of a God leading a nomadic people through the desert. It's incompatible with that early, almost military-style organization of the tribes.
Okay.
And for similar reasons, the word stays pretty rare even after they enter the land. You don't see it much in the book of Samuel or in most of the early pre-exilic prophets. And many of those prophets were often critical of the whole institution of the monarchy and its fixed trappings anyway.
There's a key stepping stone, right? You mentioned an exception, Shiloh.
Ah, yes, the Shiloh exception. This is crucial.
Before Jerusalem even becomes the capital, before Solomon builds the big temple, 1 Samuel tells us there was already a more permanent house of Yahweh at Shiloh.
That's right.
And the text says it had actual doors and doorposts. It wasn't just flaps of a tent.
Exactly. And it's right there, in that context, describing the Shiloh shrine, that we find the very first recorded religious use of hêl. Hêl. It's in 1 Samuel 1, verse 9, and chapter 3, verse 3.
So the first time it's used for God's house isn't even for the Jerusalem temple, but for this earlier place at Shiloh.
Correct. And that's a really powerful piece of data. Shiloh represents that transition point. It was the main fixed place of worship before the ark was captured by the Philistines and before David conquered Jerusalem and made it the capital.
So it wasn't the huge stone temple Solomon would build, but it was definitely more substantial than the mobile tent they'd had before.
Much more substantial. And interestingly, the text in 1 Samuel uses Helu almost interchangeably with Bet-Yah, house of Yahweh, in the same stories. You see Bet-Yah in chapter 1, verse 7, and chapter 3, verse 15.
So already at Shiloh, hell is seen as synonymous with God's house.
It seems so. By applying Hêḳāl to the Shiloh structure, even before Jerusalem, the writers are sort of signaling that the concept of a royal palace for God was already mentally attached to the central religious institution. As soon as that institution stopped being just a tent, the word was kind of waiting in the wings, you could say, for the right, magnificent building to come along.
And that building arrives with Solomon, which brings us to phase 2, the monarchic establishment.
Exactly. Once Solomon builds that massive permanent structure in Jerusalem, the word Hêḳāl finally finds its proper home, and its usage just explodes. It increases exponentially. This is when the word really cements itself in Israel's religious language.
And during this period, the monarchy, it's used more broadly, not just for one specific room yet.
Initially, yes. During this time, Hell is often used in a wide sense as a general name for the entire temple complex in Jerusalem. Synonymous again with Bet-Yah, the house of Yahweh. It describes the whole place of worship that the kings now controlled and patronized.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Think about 2 Kings 23, verse 4. It talks about bringing items out of the Hêḳāl of Yahweh during Josiah's reforms context, suggests the whole complex. Or Jeremiah 7, verse 4. The prophet warns the people not to put their trust in just repeating the Hêḳāl of Yahweh, the Hêḳāl of Yahweh, the Hêḳāl of Yahweh. He means don't rely on the mere existence of the building for security. He's referring to the temple, generally.
Right, the institution itself.
Precisely, and if you look at which books use it most, its frequency jumps way up in Kings, Ezekiel, and Chronicles.
Which makes sense. Kings and Chronicles are the official histories of the monarchy. They're naturally focused on the political and religious center that David and Solomon established.
Exactly. Using Hêḳāl helps legitimize and glorify that state sanctuary.
And Ezekiel?
Well, Ezekiel is intensely focused on the temple. He's describing its past desecration, but also offering this incredibly detailed vision of a future purified temple. So he's naturally going to use the technical terminology for it, including Hêḳāl. This surge in usage really marks the point where Hêḳāl becomes the standard institutional word for the permanent royal dwelling of God in Jerusalem.
And remarkably, that status survives even the destruction of that temple.
Which takes us to phase 3, post-exilic standardization.
That's right. After the trauma of the Babylonian exile and the eventual return led by figures like Zerubbabel, the word Hêḳāl doesn't lose its standing. It holds on to its dignity and becomes the standard general term for the Second Temple, the one they rebuilt.
So it carries the memory of that fixed royal sanctuary, even when there isn't an Israelite king on the throne anymore.
Exactly. You see it in the prophets urging the people to rebuild, like in Haggai chapter 2, verses 15 and 18, or in Zechariah's vision of the future branch, the priest-king figure who will build the Hêḳāl of Yahweh, Zech 6.3 or 15.
And in Ezra, describing the rebuilding process, definitely. Ezra uses it frequently when talking about laying the foundation, dedicating the new structure, and getting the sacrificial system going again. Ezra 3.6:10. By this point, the term was just baked in. It was the word for the temple, irreplaceable.
It's like maybe thinking about government buildings. In the early days of a country, people might just talk about the ruler's house or the administration building.
Right.
But once you have a permanent capital, a stable government, and maybe a grand building is constructed, you start using a more specific institutional name, like the Capitol or the White House or Parliament.
That's a really good analogy.
That specialized name becomes standard, and that's kind of what Hêḳāl did for the temple in Jerusalem. It marked the shift from the mobile tent to the fixed, permanent, royal seat of God's presence established by the monarchy.
Exactly. It signifies that institutionalization.
Okay, that historical sweep is really helpful. But now you're saying we need to zoom in from the big picture history to, like, architectural blueprints.
We do. Because while Hêḳāl is often used loosely for the whole temple complex, the part representing the whole, when the Bible gets into the nitty-gritty architectural details, the word Hêḳāl suddenly gets very specific. It refers to one particular, very important room.
Okay, this is where the technical meaning comes in. We shift from Hêḳāl, meaning the temple complex, to Hell, meaning what exactly?
Meaning the holy place. Specifically in the detailed construction accounts for Solomon's temple, especially in 1 Kings chapters 6 and 7, hêl takes on this very precise technical meaning. It's the main hall, the central room, or the nave of the temple building itself. This specific area is what's generally known as the holy place, in Hebrew, kudeh.
The holy place. Okay, so help me picture the layout. If the temple is a building, where is the hêl inside it?
You need to think of the main temple building as having 3 distinct sections, moving inwards from the entrance. The hêl is defined by where it sits physically. It's sandwiched right between the outer entrance area and the innermost, most sacred space.
Okay, so picture walking up to the temple building.
Right. You first enter an area called the ker, the ulam. That's basically the entrance hall, the vestibule, the foyer. Think of it as the preparation space before you go into the main sanctuary.
Got it, the foyer, ulam.
Then you move past the hul, deeper into the building, and you enter the hêl. This is the main, large, central hall.
The nave, the holy place.
Exactly. And then, at the very back of the hêl, separated by a veil or some kind of partition, was the third space, the the debir. That's the inner sanctuary, what we usually call the Holy of Holies, or the most holy place.
Okay, so it goes ulam, foyer, then hêl, holy plesenav, then debir, holy of holies, like a progression inwards.
Precisely. And the scriptures themselves confirm this specific spatial meaning. 1 Kings 6, verse 3 actually calls it Iula, which means the hêl of the house, or the main hall of the house. It distinguishes it within the larger house.
And this hêl, the main hall, it was pretty big, right? What was inside it? What happened there?
Oh, it was large, yes. Often described as being lined with cedar. Very ornate. And functionally, this is key, the hêl was the room that the regular priests entered every day to do their duties.
Okay, so high traffic area for priests.
Relatively speaking, yes. This is where they would tend to the golden lampstand, the menorah. It's where they burn incense on the golden altar of incense. It's where they place the fresh showbread, the bread of the presence, on its special table each week. It was the active workspace of the priesthood within the sanctuary proper.
Right, which makes it very different from the room behind it, the debir.
Completely different. That inner sanctuary, the debir, is explicitly distinguished from the hêl. The debir was typically a perfect cube, understood to be dark, housing the Ark of the Covenant, the symbolic throne of God. And crucially, only the high priest could enter the debir, and only once a year on the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur.
So the hêl was holy, definitely part of the sanctuary, but it was functionally separate from the most holy place, where God's presence was thought to be uniquely concentrated above the ark.
Exactly. The hêl is holy space, but the debir is the holiest space.
And does this specific architectural meaning hold up elsewhere, like in Ezekiel's vision?
It does. Even when Ezekiel is describing his highly symbolic visionary temple in chapters 40 through 48, when he uses hêl in the architectural descriptions, like in Ezekiel 41 verses 1, 4, 15, it still primarily refers to that main hall or nave, the holy place.
Okay.
Now, Ezekiel might occasionally use hêl a bit more loosely elsewhere in the vision, maybe to refer to an outer sanctuary or some other part of the larger complex, like maybe in 41.1r, 42.8, the interpretation can be debated. But that core technical meaning, the main hall between the foyer and the Holy of Holies, remains central to his blueprint too.
So we really have to keep both uses in mind when we read the word. Sometimes hêl just means the temple, the whole magnificent building or complex, like when Jeremiah uses it.
Right, the general religious usage.
But other times, especially in architectural contexts like Kings or Ezekiel, hêl means just one specific part of that complex, the main hall, the holy place.
Exactly. Part versus whole. And just to be clear on the terminology for the whole thing, that entire structure, ulam, hêl, and debir together, the usual term for that whole building is Dogur Ba'yu, house of Yahweh, or sometimes just Yehovah, the house.
The house, okay.
And even the house itself, the main building, is then contrasted with the foe, the far, that's the surrounding courtyards, the open areas where most of the people would gather, and where the large altar for burnt offerings stood. The hêl, in its specific sense, was part of the inner sanctum, off limits to ordinary Israelites, reserved for the priests performing their duties.
Okay, that clarifies the different layers. Now, given that hêl became such an important word, this grand state-connected term, how does it stack up against the other, maybe more common Hebrew words for God's dwelling place, especially Beit?
That's the crucial comparison. We need to set hêl alongside the dominant vocabulary.
And the main one is Beit, meaning house or building. You said hêl appears 78 times. How many times for Beit again?
About 2,048 times in the Old Testament.
Whoa. Okay, 78 versus over 2,000. That's a huge difference.
It tells you immediately which word carries the general, everyday, indigenous weight. Beit is the default.
And specifically for the temple.
Beit, house of Yahweh, is the usual phrase. It occurs 255 times, specifically referring to the temple. Now, as we said, hêḳāl is often used synonymously with Beit Yah when talking about the Jerusalem temple in that wide sense.
Right.
But here's the really critical distinction. Beit, or Beit Yah, is the bigger umbrella term. It's the encompassing concept. It includes the entire structure, the active hêḳāl, the nave, and the hidden debir, the Holy of Holies. Beit covers the whole theological reality of God's house.
So hêḳāl might be grander, maybe more specific architecturally sometimes, but Beit is broader, more foundational.
I think that's a good way to put it. And what makes Beit so theologically rich, so powerful, is its amazing dual meaning. This is where we really need to pause and look closely at one of the most brilliant rhetorical moments in the entire Bible, 2 Samuel chapter 7.
Ah, David wanting to build God a house.
Exactly, because Beit doesn't just mean a physical building like a temple. It can also mean family, lineage, or dynasty.
Right, like the house of David.
Precisely. So in 2 Samuel 7, David comes to the prophet Nathan. He feels bad living in his fancy cedar palace while the Ark of God, God's presence, is still dwelling in a simple tent. David says, basically, I'm going to build God a magnificent Beit, meaning a temple.
He wants to upgrade God's accommodations.
He does. But God's response through Nathan is this stunning reversal. Look at 2 Samuel 7, verses 5, 11, and 29. God essentially says, you want to build me a Beit, a house, a temple. No, David, I don't need that. Instead, I am going to build you a Beit.
Meaning a dynasty, a lineage, an enduring royal house.
Exactly. God flips the script entirely. This is an intentional, powerful play on the word beta. God is saying, my presence and my promises aren't ultimately contained in your architecture, David, no matter how grand. The real house I'm building, the enduring structure of my covenant, is your family line, your dynasty. That's the beta that matters.
Wow. That contrast, it's incredible. It really elevates the whole concept of Beit way beyond just bricks and mortar or even the specific grandeur of a hêḳāl. The hêḳāl is the building. The Beit, in God's economy here, is the living covenant community centered on the promise to David.
It's a theological masterstroke.
Yeah.
It puts the focus squarely on covenant relationship and divine promise rather than just the physical structure.
Okay, so Beit is the broad foundational covenantal term. How does hêḳāl relate back to the even earlier place of worship, the tent, the jul?
Well, Dee touched on this with Shiloh. hêḳāl connects to that earlier institution because it was first applied to the Shiloh shrine, which was the fixed center during the period when the tent of meeting was still the conceptual ideal, even if Shiloh itself was more building-like. So hêḳāl acts as that historical bridge word between the tent era and the full temple era.
Right, and the tent itself, the jul, that word appears quite a bit too.
Oh, yes. Shiloh occurs 435 times in the Old Testament, and about 60% of those times it's used in the specific religious sense of the tent of meeting, the Shiloh mode.
So Shiloh pent, then hêḳāl applied to Shiloh, then hêl becomes standard for the temple, often synonymous with Bet Yah, but Beit Bet You remains the overarching term.
That's the progression, and the theological significance of that shift in primary vocabulary from the mobile, accessible shell where God's presence traveled with the people, to the permanent state-sponsored hêḳāl, a word borrowed from imperial palaces.
Yeah.
That shift is linguistic proof of a massive political and theological change. Institutionalization. It signals Israel committing to a centralized monarchy with a fixed capital city, fixed laws, and a fixed place for God's presence, moving away from the more flexible tribal confederation model of the wilderness and early settlement periods.
The language reflects the politics and the theology.
Directly. Now, it's worth noting, hêḳāl is also sometimes listed as a synonym for other general words for sanctuary, like mikdash. But it's that unique pedigree traceable back to Sumerian eagle, great house or palace, that gives hêḳāl its distinctive flavor.
So the takeaway is?
The takeaway is that hêḳāl brilliantly manages to blend two key ideas: state grandeur, reflecting the monarchy, and divine sanctity, reflecting God's presence. It represents the magnificent fixed reality of the Jerusalem sanctuary, setting it apart from the earlier portable tent. But at the same time, it gives that fixed sanctuary the royal status, appropriate for the king of the universe, who is now, in a sense, taken up permanent residence in their capital city.
Okay, so we've traced this word through some pretty dramatic shifts on Earth. It went from being completely absent in the early days to being rarely used for Shiloh, to becoming the specific name for the main hall, the holy place, inside Solomon's temple.
The nave, yeah.
And then broadening out again to become the general word for the second temple after the exile. That's a lot of change in how it's applied to earthly buildings.
It is. Very dynamic.
But amidst all that change, all that chronological development focused on earth, you're saying there's one meaning of hail that stays perfectly rock solid, consistent across all time periods, all types of biblical literature.
That's the remarkable thing, yes. Despite all the ups and downs of the earthly temple, built, destroyed, rebuilt, one application of hail remains completely stable. It's used to designate Yahweh's heavenly palace or abode.
God's palace in heaven.
Exactly. This meaning is fixed. Doesn't matter if you're reading early poetry from David's time or late prophecy after the exile. Hail consistently refers to God's celestial dwelling. It immediately frames God as the enthroned king, ruling over everything from heaven, completely independent of what's happening with the building in Jerusalem.
Okay, that provides a really important anchor, doesn't it?
A vital theological ballast. Absolutely. Think about it. When the Babylonians destroyed the physical hail in Jerusalem, it was catastrophic. But the prophets can still confidently assert that God's rule was unbroken, his sovereignty intact. Why? Because the ultimate hail, the one in heaven, was untouched. It remained.
So the earthly temple, even Solomon's glorious one, was really just a copy, a model, a representation on earth of the real thing in heaven.
That's a very common understanding, yes. The earthly hill is constructed as a physical, localized projection, a model of that unseen, eternal royal court in the heavens.
And we see this heavenly meaning clearly in specific texts.
Oh, absolutely. Especially in poetic and prophetic passages. Take Isaiah chapter 6, verse 1, the famous vision where Isaiah sees Yahweh. Where is God? He's seated on the throne, high and exalted, and the train of his robe filled the hail.
Right. Filled the temple.
But the context makes it clear. This isn't primarily the building in Jerusalem he's seeing. It's a heavenly vision. God is enthroned in his celestial hêkār. That vision grounds Isaiah's prophetic commission in the reality of God's cosmic authority, not just his presence in the earthly building.
Okay. Other examples.
Micah chapter 1, verse 2. It speaks of Yahweh coming forth from his hêkār to judge the earth. Again, the sense is celestial origin. Or Habakkuk 2, verse 20. Yahweh is in his holy hêkār. Let all the earth be silent before him. That command for universal silence makes most sense if God is in his heavenly throne room, the cosmic center.
And the Psalms.
The Psalms use it this way consistently. Often hell is directly paralleled with the Hebrew word hemeim, which just means heavens.
Ah, okay. So the poetry makes the connection explicit.
It does. Look at Psalm 11, verse 4. Yahweh is in his holy heli, Yahweh's throne is in heaven, bashamayim. Or Psalm 18, verse 6, which is almost identical to Psalm 22, verse 7, where David cries out in distress, and he says God heard his voice from his hêkār. Often this is pictured during a storm, God answering from the heavens. It signals that God's help comes from his celestial command center, his heavenly palace.
So the consistency here is really striking. All the change and development we tracked earlier, Shiloh, the nave, the second temple, that's all about the earthly structure.
Exactly. Focus on the earthly manifestation.
But the heavenly meaning, that stays fixed. Across all the books, all the time periods, it keeps reminding the reader that the building on Mount Zion, however magnificent or important it was ultimately just a shadow, a pattern based on the eternal celestial court of the great king.
Precisely. It keeps the ultimate emphasis on the sovereign God enthroned in heaven, whose rule continues regardless of the fate of any earthly architecture.
Okay, we have covered a lot of ground, just focusing on this one word, help. Let's try to quickly wrap up the main points. We basically found its core meaning is stable, magnificent royal dwelling.
Right.
But that meaning plays out in three main ways in the Bible. First, it can mean an earthly palace, though that's rare.
Usually foreign or problematic ones, yeah.
Second, in detailed architectural descriptions, it specifically means the holy place, the main hall or nave inside the temple building itself.
Between the foyer and the holiest holies.
And third, and most consistently across all time, it means God's heavenly dwelling, his celestial palace.
That's the stable anchor.
And we traced how the word really came into prominence. Its frequency increased dramatically right when Israel's worship became centralized, permanent, institutionalized, and tied to the monarchy in Jerusalem, starting with Solomon.
The linguistic shift mirrored the political and religious shift.
And then if we bring back that comparison you made between hell and the more common word beit, house, that relationship offers a really important theological nuance, doesn't it?
I think it does. The grand structure, the hêḳāl, definitely represented the permanence and the royal status established by the monarchy. It was impressive, institutional.
Yeah.
But the more general term, bet-hay, the house of Yahweh, that remained the broader, maybe even the preferred overarching concept.
Mm-hmm.
It encompassed everything, the Holy of Holies, the courts outside, and it carried that deep covenantal weight, especially from 2 Samuel 7, the promise of God building a house, a dynasty for David. Beit always kept that wider sense of God's dwelling place among his covenant people.
Okay, that distinction sets up, I think, a really interesting final thought for us to consider, especially as we think about moving from the old covenant to the new.
Go on.
We established that hêḳāl, the palace word, really took off once the permanent physical building became the geographic center of Israel's worship.
Right, tied to that fixed location and structure.
Okay, so now consider this. The New Testament writers, drawing on all this rich Old Testament background, start talking about the church, the community of believers, as being God's house or God's temple.
Yes, frequently, Peter, Paul.
But crucially, it's described as a spiritual house, a temple not built with human hands.
Made of living stones.
Exactly. So when the New Testament uses language that emphasizes the living community, the people, as God's dwelling, isn't it, in a way, reclaiming the spiritual breadth of that older covenantal concept of Beit?
That's a fascinating way to put it.
It seems like it's deliberately moving away from the architectural specificity and the fixed location associated with hêḳāl, the grand palace.
And returning the emphasis to
the people as the house. The living, portable structure, the true house of God's covenant people. It feels like it fulfills God's promise in Samuel 7. In a deeper way, God dwells with his people, not primarily in a building, whether it's a tent or a palace, but through his spirit within the community of faith.
Moving the focus from the localized architectural masterpiece back to the dynamic presence of God among his people wherever they are. Reclaiming the portability of the Sheol, but in a spiritual sense.
Yeah, away from the hell and back to the deepest meaning of Beit. That feels like a shift worth thinking more about.
Absolutely. A profound shift.
Definitely something to dwell on.